The sun had barely risen over Karnak when the girl was led into the temple courtyard. She was 9 years old, small for her age, and still smelled of dust from the long road that had brought her there. Her name was Nefertari, and she clutched her father's hand as if it were the last solid thing in the world. The stones beneath her bare feet were cold. The air smelled of incense, oil, and something sharper that she did not recognize. Around her, tall columns rose like silent judges, carved with gods who stared down without mercy. Her father did not look at her. His eyes stayed low, fixed on the ground, as if he feared that meeting her gaze would break whatever strength he had left. 3 days earlier, he had brought her here to settle a debt. Grain had failed. Silver was gone. The temple of Ammon did not forgive what it was owed. So he paid with the only thing he still possessed, his child. The priests moved with calm precision. They did not rush. They never did. Time inside the temple belonged to them. An older priestess stepped forward, her linen robe perfectly clean, her head already shaved smooth. Without asking permission, she took Nefertari by the arm and pulled her toward a stone stool placed in the center of the courtyard. The girl's fingers slipped from her father's hand. He stepped back. He said nothing. A bronze razor caught the morning light. Nefertari did not understand what was about to happen until the first braid fell onto the stone. The blade scraped across her scalp, cold and unforgiving. Her long black hair, once brushed carefully by her mother, fell away in uneven clumps. Tears ran down her cheeks. She tried to pull back, but strong hands held her still. When she cried out, the priestess struck her across the face. It was fast, sharp, practiced. "Servants of the god do not cry," the woman said. Her voice was flat, without anger or emotion. "You have no tears now. You have no name." Nefertari did not know what those words meant, but she felt their weight. Something was being taken from her, something deeper than hair or childhood comfort. When the shaving was finished, her head burned under the sun, exposed and raw. The priestess leaned close and whispered words meant to sound sacred, but felt like a sentence. "You belong to Ammon now." That moment ended Nefertari's old life. No ceremony marked it. No blessing softened it. Only silence followed as she was led away from the courtyard, through a narrow doorway, and into the interior of the temple. She never saw her father again. Inside, the world changed. Light faded. Corridors twisted and narrowed. Painted walls showed gods receiving offerings, smiling eternally, frozen in perfection. None of the images showed fear. None showed children being taken. This was the face the temple wanted the world to see. Nefertari was given a new garment, plain linen, rough against her skin. Her name was removed from her. From that day forward, she was known only by a title, servant of the god. It sounded important. It sounded holy. But it meant she no longer belonged to herself. Her days followed strict rules. She woke before dawn. She learned to stand, walk, and bow in precise ways. She learned silence. Questions were punished. Disobedience was corrected swiftly and without explanation. Food was measured. Sleep was controlled. Even her thoughts began to feel watched. Other girls lived there too. Some were older, some younger. None spoke freely. They had all arrived the same way, through debts, offerings, or capture. Some had been brought by parents who believed the temple would protect their daughters. Others had been handed over by soldiers, taken from villages far from the Nile. Different origins, same fate. The priests told them they were chosen, that their bodies were pure, that they were closer to the gods than ordinary people. But purity inside the temple did not mean safety. It meant control. Their movements were tracked, their bodies inspected, their lives planned down to the smallest detail. Every breath belonged to the system that owned them, Years would pass, but the pattern never changed. Nefertari would grow inside those walls, learning rituals whose meanings were never fully explained. She would be told what to wear, when to eat, where to stand, and when to lower her eyes. She would never own property, never marry, never decide her future. The outside world faded into something distant and unreal. What most people never realize is that Nefertari was not unique. She was one of thousands. Egypt's temples were filled with girls and women like her, hidden from public view, praised in titles, erased in reality. The words carved into stone spoke of holiness and devotion. The papyri buried in archives told a different story, and deep within the temple, beyond the corridors Nefertari was allowed to enter, there were chambers she would one day be taken to, places with no paintings, no witnesses, no prayers meant for mercy. That was where her true service would begin, and she had no idea what was waiting for her there. As the years passed inside the temple, Nefertari slowly learned that words did not mean what they sounded like. The priests spoke often of purity, but purity was never explained as kindness or protection. It was taught as obedience. A pure servant was one who did not question, who did not resist, who allowed her body and time to be shaped by others. Every morning, Nefertari and the other girls were inspected by senior priestesses, their hands, faces, and posture examined as if they were objects rather than children. Dirt was sin. Fatigue was weakness. Silence was virtue. The girls were reminded again and again that their value came from being untouched by the outside world. Yet, at the same time, they were told that their bodies belonged fully to the temple. This contradiction was never addressed, because no one was allowed to ask. The image that ordinary Egyptians saw during festivals was carefully designed. On special days, the temple gates opened and processions moved through the streets. Nefertari watched from behind pillars as selected women walked past in fine linen, wearing jewelry and sacred symbols. To the crowd, they looked honored, powerful, almost divine. Mothers whispered that these women were blessed. Fathers bowed their heads in respect. What the crowd could not see were the rules behind the walls. Those women were watched constantly. Every step they took was recorded. Every action required permission. Their beauty was not for them. It was part of the temple's authority, a living decoration meant to inspire awe and obedience in others. Inside the temple, life followed a strict rhythm that left no space for personal will. Nefertari learned hymns she did not fully understand, memorized gestures whose meanings were never explained, and practiced rituals that demanded perfect movement but offered no comfort. The priests said the gods demanded precision, and mistakes brought punishment not just to the girl, but to the entire temple. This fear kept everyone in line. If one child failed, all suffered. Slowly, the girls began to watch each other, correcting mistakes before the priests noticed. Control no longer came only from above. It spread between them. Purity also meant separation. The girls were forbidden from forming close bonds. Friendship was considered distraction. Love was considered dangerous. Even family memories were treated as weakness. Nefertari was punished once for whispering her mother's name in her sleep. The priestess who heard her dragged her from the mat and made her kneel for hours on cold stone, repeating prayers until her voice cracked. "Your family is the god," the priestess said. "Your past is nothing." Over time, Nefertari felt her memories fade, not because she wanted them to, but because holding on to them hurt too much. As she grew older, new lessons began. Older girls were separated from the younger ones and taken deeper into the temple. They returned quieter, their eyes lowered, their movements careful and tense. No one explained what happened in those inner chambers. Questions were met with silence or punishment. But the change was visible. The girls carried themselves differently, as if they were constantly bracing for something unseen. Nefertari noticed that some priestesses held more power than others, not because of wisdom or age, but because of their closeness to certain priests. Purity, it seemed, did not protect them from authority. It placed them closer to it. The temple taught that the gods spoke through priests, and to obey the priests was to obey the divine. This belief was repeated until it became truth. The girls were told that resistance offended the gods, that suffering was proof of devotion, and that silence was sacred. Pain was reframed as duty. Fear was called reverence. In this way, control became invisible, wrapped so tightly in religion that it felt natural, even necessary. Outside the temple walls, stories spread of holy women who lived lives of honor and privilege. In reality, many of those women aged inside the same stone corridors, their youth consumed by service, their bodies worn by rituals, their futures already decided. Some were transferred to other temples. Some disappeared from records entirely. Their names survived only in lists, reduced to titles and numbers. No one recorded their thoughts, their feelings, or their losses. Nefertari began to understand that the temple did not exist to serve the gods alone. It served power. It served wealth. It served those who controlled access to the divine. The idea of purity was the key that locked the door. By declaring the girls sacred, the temple removed them from ordinary law and family protection. No father could reclaim a daughter given to the gods. No court would question the will of a priest. What happened inside the temple was beyond challenge. At night, lying awake on her mat, Nefertari listened to the distant sounds of rituals echoing through stone halls. She did not know what awaited her as she grew older, but she sensed that the life she had known as a child was gone forever. The walls around her were not only stone. They were beliefs, rules, and fears built carefully over generations. And beyond the chambers she had already seen, there were deeper spaces sealed from the eyes of the public, where purity took on a meaning far darker than any prayer could hide. As Nefertari grew into her early teenage years, she began to understand something the priests never spoke about openly. Yet everyone inside the temple knew in silence. The temple was not only a place of worship, it was a machine. A vast system of land, labor, grain, silver, and power, all moving under the authority of the gods, but controlled by men. From within its walls, priests managed storehouses larger than any private estate, fields worked by thousands of laborers, and treasuries filled with offerings collected from across Egypt. The people believed they were feeding the gods. In reality, they were feeding an institution that never stopped growing. Nefertari saw this truth in small details at first. She watched scribes enter the temple carrying scrolls instead of prayer offerings, their hands stained with ink rather than incense. She listened as priests discussed harvest yields, debt records, and shipments from distant lands, using the same serious tones they used during rituals. She noticed how grain was counted carefully, how silver was weighed again and again, and how nothing was ever given without something being demanded in return. The temple spoke the language of holiness, but it operated with the discipline of a marketplace. The girls, she slowly realized, were part of this economy. They were not only servants of ritual, they were assets. When families brought daughters to the temple, it was recorded like a transaction. A name, an age, a reason. Debt repayment, religious offering, tribute. Once entered into the records, the girl was no longer a child in the eyes of the system. She became temple property. Her labor, her obedience, and her future all belonged to the institution that claimed divine authority over her life. Priests often reminded the girls that they owed everything to the temple. Food, shelter, protection, and purpose, all provided by the gods through priestly hands. What they did not say was that the temple profited enormously from their presence. Girls cleaned, prepared offerings, produced textiles, performed music, assisted rituals, and maintained the daily operations that kept the institution functioning smoothly. Their work was unpaid, unquestioned, and endless. Because it was called sacred, it could never be refused. Nefertari learned that many girls arrived not because their families were devout, but because they were desperate. When droughts struck or floods failed, temples became lenders. Grain was given out with strict terms. Silver loans came with heavy interest. Families who could not repay faced consequences that were never written in public decrees. A daughter offered to the temple erased a debt completely. In times of crisis, this choice was praised as noble. In reality, it was final. Once a girl crossed the temple threshold, no agreement allowed her return. The priests understood the power of belief. They taught families that giving a daughter to the gods brought blessings, protection, and honor. Parents were told their sacrifice would be remembered by the divine. Many believed it. Others simply had no choice. Hunger is louder than faith. Fear is stronger than hope. The temple offered a solution that appeared holy and legal, even when it destroyed a family forever. There were also girls who arrived without families at all. Nefertari saw them brought in after military campaigns, their skin darker, their languages unfamiliar. Nubian, Libyan, and Levantine children captured as tribute were absorbed into temple service quietly, their origins stripped away. The records listed them as offerings from conquered lands, no different from gold or livestock. Their grief was invisible to the system that processed them. As Nefertari matured, she was assigned more responsibilities and allowed closer to the administrative heart of the temple. There, she saw shelves filled with papyri, documenting lives in numbers and titles. She found her own entry once, by accident. It did not describe her fear, her loss, or her stolen childhood. It simply recorded her age, status, and assignment. That was all the temple needed to know about her. The older women whispered that escape was impossible. The temple's authority reached beyond its walls, backed by law, belief, and force. A servant of the god who fled would be hunted, not because she had broken human law, but because she had offended the divine. There were stories of runaways dragged back, punished publicly, then erased from all records. Fear kept most from even imagining freedom. Nefertari began to understand that the temple's greatest strength was not its wealth, but its ability to make exploitation appear sacred. By wrapping control in ritual and debt in devotion, the system protected itself from question. No one challenged what they believed the gods demanded. And so the machine continued, fed by faith, fear, and the lives of children who never chose this fate, yet beyond the storerooms and records. Beyond the economic heart of the temple, there were inner chambers few spoke of openly, places where the true cost of this system was paid in silence. As Nefertari was prepared for new duties, she sensed she was being drawn closer to those hidden spaces, where the temple's power revealed its most secret and dangerous form. The first time Nefertari saw the foreign girls arrive, she did not understand why the air inside the temple changed. It was subtle, a tension that settled like dust after a door closed. The girls were brought in at night, escorted by guards rather than priests, their wrists marked with rope burns that had not yet faded. They did not wear linen. They wore the remains of travel clothes, torn and stiff with dirt. Their eyes moved constantly, searching for something familiar that did not exist inside these walls. Nefertari recognized that look immediately, because it was the same one she herself had worn years earlier. Before the temple taught her how to hide it, these girls came from beyond Egypt's borders, Nubia, Libya, the Levant. Their villages had been burned or emptied after military campaigns, their families scattered or killed, their lives reduced to spoils of war. In the language of the temple records, they were called tribute. In reality, they were captives. Their names were rarely written down. When they were, The names were often changed to Egyptian ones, stripping away the last trace of where they came from. Identity, like freedom, did not survive long inside the temple. The priests explained their arrival with calm authority. Egypt, they said, was favored by the gods. Victory in war was proof of divine approval. Those taken from conquered lands were now part of sacred order. Serving the gods was presented as mercy, a better fate than slavery in fields or death on the road. But this mercy came with absolute control. The girls were watched more closely than the others. Their movements were restricted. Their language was forbidden. Even their grief was treated as defiance. Nefertari was assigned to help train some of them. She showed them how to bow correctly, how to walk without making noise, how to lower their eyes when a priest passed. She did not explain why. Experience had taught her that understanding came slowly and painfully. The captives struggled at first. Some cried openly. Some refused to eat. One girl tried to run. She was caught before reaching the outer gate. No one ever spoke of her again. Her mat was removed the next morning, and the space she had occupied was left empty, as if she had never existed. What frightened Nefertari most was how quickly the temple absorbed them. Within months, the girls' posture changed. Their voices softened. Their resistance faded. Hunger, fear, and punishment did their work efficiently. The temple did not need chains. Belief and discipline were enough. The captives were told that obedience would bring favor, that suffering purified the soul, and that their past lives were meaningless now. Slowly, they began to repeat these ideas themselves. Because believing made survival easier. The older women whispered that foreign girls were often sent deeper into the temple sooner than others. They were considered expendable, their absence less likely to raise questions. If one disappeared, there was no family in Thebes to ask why. No name carved into a local tomb. No one to remember her beyond the walls. Nefertari watched as some were selected and led away, their faces pale, their steps uncertain. They did not return the same. Some did not return at all. The temple records reflected this cruelty with cold efficiency. Lists of offerings included gold, cattle, grain, and people. Captive girls were counted like goods, assigned to departments, temples, or priests. Their worth was measured in usefulness, not humanity. The scribes never wrote about fear or pain. They wrote numbers, titles, transfers. Deaths, when recorded, were brief and impersonal. "Return to the gods," the line often read. Nefertari began to understand that the temple thrived on invisibility. The more distant a girl's origin, the easier it was to erase her. The system depended on silence from those inside and ignorance from those outside. Public ceremonies showed order and beauty. Inner chambers held the truth. The captives learned this lesson faster than most. They had already seen what power looked like without mercy. Now they were trapped inside a version of it, dressed in holiness. At night, Nefertari sometimes heard quiet sobbing from the mats beside her. She did not reach out. Touch was forbidden. Comfort was dangerous. The temple punished attachment because attachment created loyalty outside its control. Still, she felt the weight of shared suffering, a silent bond formed not by friendship but by survival. As time passed, Nefertari noticed that her own duties were shifting again. She was no longer assigned only to training or preparation. Senior priestesses watched her more closely now. They corrected her posture with sharper tones. They whispered to one another when they thought she could not hear. She had grown obedient, precise, and quiet. These were the qualities the temple valued most. And somewhere beyond the corridors she knew, beyond the administrative rooms and training halls, there were sealed chambers where captives and servants alike were taken once they were deemed ready. Places not marked on maps, places not described in hymns, places where the temple's most guarded rituals took place, far from public eyes. Nefertari sensed that her turn was approaching. By the time Nefertari reached full womanhood, the temple no longer treated her as a child in training. Her movements were exact. Her silence was complete. Her obedience was unquestioned. These qualities marked her as ready. No announcement was made. No ritual explained what was changing. Readiness inside the temple was never spoken aloud. It was communicated through looks, through reassigned duties, through the quiet way senior priestesses began to watch her more closely than before. She felt it in the tightening of rules around her life, in the narrowing paths she was allowed to walk, in the sense that something long delayed was finally drawing near. The inner chambers were places most servants only heard about in fragments. They were not shown in wall paintings or mentioned during public ceremonies. There were no hymns written for them. They existed beyond the visible religion of Egypt, hidden behind layers of belief and fear. The priests spoke of them as sacred spaces where the god's presence was strongest, where only the most pure could enter. But purity here did not mean innocence. It meant complete submission. To be chosen was not an honor that could be refused. When Nefertari was first taken through the deeper corridors, she noticed how the air changed. The walls were unpainted, bare stone instead of bright images. Torches burned low, casting long shadows that distorted every movement. Sound seemed to disappear, as if the temple itself was swallowing it. She walked barefoot behind a priestess she had known for years, yet the woman did not look at her once. Familiarity ended at the threshold of these spaces. Inside, there were only roles. The rituals that took place, they were never explained fully, only justified. The priests taught that the gods required living vessels, that divine power flowed through flesh before it could bless the land. They claimed ancient tradition, older than memory, written in lost texts and whispered through generations. To question these practices was to doubt the gods themselves. And doubt, the temple said, invited chaos, famine, and divine punishment upon all Egypt. Nefertari learned quickly that consent had no meaning in a place where divine will was absolute. The temple did not ask. It informed. The girls were told that their bodies no longer belonged to the human world. They were instruments of balance, offerings that sustained order. Pain was reframed as service. Fear was called transformation. Silence was demanded not only for obedience, but for survival. What happened in those chambers could never be spoken aloud, even among those who experienced it. Some women returned from the inner chambers, changed in ways that could not be hidden. Their eyes were distant, their movements careful, almost fragile. Others were transferred to different temples without explanation, their departure sudden and permanent. A few were never seen again. Their names were removed from duty lists, their mats quietly taken away. When asked, priestesses said they had been returned to the gods, as if death itself were a promotion. The temple protected these rituals with layers of secrecy. Only a small number of priests were allowed access. Even among the priestesses, knowledge was divided carefully. No one held the full truth. This ensured silence. This ensured loyalty. Fear thrived in uncertainty, and the temple understood fear better than mercy. By keeping the worst acts hidden, it preserved the illusion of holiness for those who served in outer halls and for the society that supported it. Nefertari realized that the greatest lie was not the rituals themselves, but the belief that they were necessary. The temple claimed the gods demanded everything. In truth, it was power that demanded obedience. The rituals reinforced hierarchy. They reminded everyone inside who controlled bodies, futures, and faith. By binding suffering to divine purpose, the temple turned exploitation into duty and erased the possibility of resistance. At night, after returning from duties near the inner corridors, Nefertari lay awake, listening to the faint echoes that traveled through stone. She did not know what awaited her fully, but she understood now that there would be no escape. The temple had prepared her carefully for this moment, shaping her mind long before it claimed her body. This was not sudden. It was planned. It always had been. And somewhere deep within those sealed chambers, beyond the reach of public belief and carved stone, the temple guarded its darkest truth, one that history would try to forget, but could never fully erase. Nefertari lived inside the temple for more than 4 decades, though time there did not move the way it did beyond the walls. Seasons passed without meaning. Kings rose and fell, wars were fought, treaties signed, and floods came and went. Yet inside the stone corridors life followed the same unchanging rhythm. She became older, quieter, and almost invisible, which was exactly what the temple required. Youth had made her valuable. Age made her disposable. Still, she remained, performing her duties until her body no longer carried the strength it once had. What the temple did best was forgetting. Women who could no longer serve were moved away from central spaces, assigned to lesser tasks, or transferred quietly to distant sanctuaries. Some were sent to provincial temples where records were poorly kept. Others simply vanished from the lists. Their absence raised no questions, because the system had been designed to erase them. The god did not require explanations, and neither did the priests. Long after Nefertari's name disappeared from daily records, fragments of her existence survived in ways the temple never intended. Papyri buried in archives, accounting documents listing transfers of servants, letters between officials discussing temple resources. None of these texts spoke of suffering directly. They did not need to. The truth lived between the lines. Ages that were too young, terms that disguised ownership, notes that recorded women as assets rather than people. Centuries later, historians would begin to notice these patterns and ask uncomfortable questions. Archaeology would reveal sealed rooms with no decoration, unlike the rest of the temple that celebrated divine order. These spaces held no beauty, only function. Inscriptions avoided them entirely. Ancient writers praised the temples as centers of wisdom and morality, yet remained silent about the lives consumed inside them. Silence, historians realized, was not absence of evidence. It was evidence of intent. What was hidden had been hidden on purpose. The Temple of Amun, like others across Egypt, presented itself as eternal and unchanging, but it depended on systems that could not survive exposure. Religious authority shielded economic exploitation. Sacred titles masked permanent servitude. By declaring girls holy, the temple removed them from family protection and human law. It claimed their bodies, their futures, and their silence in the name of balance and order. Nefertari did not die as a martyr or a rebel. She died as she had lived for most of her life, unseen. No tomb recorded her story. No statue carried her face. She became one of countless women whose lives were absorbed into stone walls and forgotten rituals. Yet her existence was real, and so was her suffering. The temple could erase names, but it could not erase patterns, and patterns are what history eventually uncovers. What makes this story difficult is not only its cruelty, but its familiarity. Power has always learned to dress itself as virtue. Control has always hidden behind language that sounds noble. When authority claims to speak for gods, questioning becomes dangerous, and abuse becomes sacred duty. Ancient Egypt was not unique in this. It was simply honest enough in its records for the truth to survive. The gods carved on temple walls still stare down in perfect silence, but the human cost beneath them is no longer completely hidden. Through fragments, ruins, and forgotten documents, voices like Nefertari's reach across time, not to accuse, but to remind. Civilization can build wonders and still destroy the vulnerable. Faith can inspire beauty and still be used as a weapon. This is what history tried to bury. Not a myth, not a legend, but a system where devotion was demanded, innocence was consumed, and silence was enforced. And the darkest truth of all is that it was allowed to happen because too many people believed holiness could never be cruel.